Very good. So we had started the ninth of the 13 midos. We are up to page Chaf Gimel in the middle of the paragraph, and this particular midah is v'sashlich b'mitzvus yam kol hatoisom, that God throws into the depths all of their transgressions, and this is somewhat of an intricate explanation of this midah. It starts off with the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings punishment to Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people, through intermediaries. And he asks, why is it that we find that if they're doing the will of Hashem, ultimately that they're punished? For example, Pharaoh, or Haman, or Nebuchadnezzar, or whoever that might be. And he doesn't give an answer. Two answers that we suggested from the outset were, number one, that the agent always has free will to choose not to be the agent. So it's not that God forces the person to do it. The person could choose not to. And therefore he's held accountable for choosing to go along with this part of the divine plan, rather than demurring and saying, if God, you want to punish the Jewish people, find somebody else to do it through. I don't want to be part of that. And if the person is doing it, it's because they've exercised their free will choice to do so, and therefore they're punished. And the second explanation that we suggested is that even if they're agents as God and should not be held accountable for doing what God wanted them to do, they're punished for going beyond what God wanted them to do, and that's why they would be held accountable. Those are just two answers that we brought in the name of either the Rambam or the Ramban. But the Ramak, Moshe Kadera, the author of the Sefer, is working through a more intricate explanation, and it's connected to the idea of the Seir Mishtalech, the scapegoat of Yom Kippur. And he still hasn't given an answer as to why it is that Jewish people's sins are transferred onto the scapegoat, and then it's thrown over the cliff. Why it is that what did the animal do wrong? Why is it that the sins of the Jewish people are passed on to the innocent animal? And if it's there for the purpose of atoning, why is it dismembered in this way? Yeah, but you're right, and I kind of addressed that point subtly yesterday, which is that not all korbanos, but the korbanos which are involved, like chatas, for example, are at least shechted in a kosher, proper way, and so forth and so on. And this animal is thrown off the cliff and dismembered. The transgressions being placed on its head. Why is it demolished after serving this purpose? We kind of had an elaborate discussion about how a person who transgresses might be refraining from doing an aseh, or might be transgressing a lo ta'aseh, and that lo ta'aseh might be very serious, involving things having to do with, for example, chiyuv misa or kares. And in this last category, we spoke about how even though tshuva and Yom Kippur atone for a person, he's only fully purified through isurim, through suffering. The point here is that a person should ask for these isurim to be brought upon him in a way which he can handle in small amounts over a large period of time, rather than drastic suffering suddenly. And this is what he writes here. Person should pray that they should be light forms of suffering, Torah, and not those which would cause him to negate from the Torah study, because the Gemara discusses how there's such a thing called Yisurim Shel Ava, which are afflictions of love that God brings a person to purify him, and that takes the form of suffering which would not prevent him from serving Hashem, but rather atone for him. And this takes the form of, the Gemara says, even if a person puts his hand in his pocket intending to pull out a 10 shekel piece and ends up pulling out a 5 shekel piece, he takes out, he puts his hand in his pocket intending to take out one coin and takes out another. And now he's got to put it back in his pocket and go reach for the other coin. Even that very small, mundane type of thwarting of his plan, the inconvenience, that is a form of atonement. And therefore, a person should really have in mind that the types of inconveniences or minor discomforts and other types of things that a person has, he should have intention that it should be kaparas avonos. It should be in the name of atoning for his transgressions. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu offers a person many, many opportunities throughout the day. He misses the bus. After running, and huffing and puffing, the driver closes the door. He knocks on the window. The driver looks at him and drives on. Right? So you can get angry and curse the guy and curse your fate and say, "Oh, God, this, that, the other thing." But he's missing a wonderful opportunity, because if he were to say humbly and graciously, "If I didn't make the bus, that comes from Hashem. May the suffering and the discomfort and the inconvenience that result from this be as a kapara for me, kapara savanos. I'm willing to accept this as a one of these ways of God's applying a bit of divine abrasiveness to clean off the residual impurities from my transgressions."
Doesn't that reaction, that positive reaction to something that would seemingly be negative, just that positive reaction itself takes away the suffering, so therefore you're not really suffering?
Well, you are suffering insofar as you're late.
Yeah, but
you obviously wanted the first bus. You wanted that bus. It was important for you for whatever reason to get that bus and not the next one. So you're definitely being put out of your way. It's true that having this approach makes the discomfort more palatable, and maybe the discomfort is therefore minimized. But the point is, if a person recognizes that this comes from Hashem, and I can rebel against it, which would only compound it, but not necessarily atone for any misdeed of mine, so there's really no point in that. Rather, the person should say, that's part and parcel of it. Recognizing that I'm not perfect, there are residual impurities resulting from my transgressions, and but I recognize that everything comes from Hashem, and it's because I deserve it. And part of the reward of taking that approach is that the burden itself is lightened, plus the fact that he also gets atoned for. If he doesn't take that approach, right, the burden just becomes exacerbated, and he doesn't get any atonement for it because he's rebelling against the suffering. So it would behoove a person of all these instances to accept his lot gracefully, and of course he can do everything. He's allowed to do what's considered to be normal and proper to secure his needs and his desires. But after doing that, if he finds that his plans have been thwarted, right, rather than rebel against God, he should humble his head and say, "This is an opportunity to do tshuva, recognize that I need to be, I'm certain there are plenty of things that have to be reckoned with. I accept this suffering as coming from Hashem." Use the opportunity to think about, why, what it might be coming from. Think about the scenario in which it happened, or the way in which I'm suffering might be an indicator of why. Use the opportunity to do tshuva. And like I said, it lightens the agony and also lightens the load. Lightens the agony because it gives you a more constructive way of dealing with your plans having been thwarted, number one. And number two, it lightens the load because it really does purify the person. So therefore, he should pray that the sufferings should be made light and should take the form of things which would not cause him to be mevatel Torah. If he's, God forbid, suffering because he's sick and he can't learn Torah and he can't daven, so that's a more strong form of suffering. It's preventing him from serving Hashem. But a person says, "I accept this suffering upon myself. I know that everything comes from Hashem and nothing comes undeserved. And there's an opportunity here for me to learn and to correct and perfect myself. I willingly and lovingly accept this suffering upon myself. May it be a kapara for my avonos." And this type of an attitude often undermines the need for the suffering in the first place. And hopefully the person will get out of it. Hashem will take the person out of it. And this is also what's meant when we say, but don't castigate us, do not reprimand us through difficult forms of suffering. And so too a person should have in mind when he says, Va'ata tzadik al kol haba olai. You are righteous and correct, God, regarding everything that comes upon me. When a person becomes inundated with suffering, he should not justify himself, but justify God for having brought the suffering upon him in order to correct him, perfect him, purify him. A person who accepts the suffering with a positive countenance, this will actually catalyze and affect his kapara, his atonement. Because there are transgressions whose severity does require that significant suffering or even death would be required to make clean what's been besmirched. But this is the attribute, the proper approach. Miyad shezeh misvade, when a person, rather than rebelling, he confesses, misvade, b'tfiloso, he says, Hashem, I realize it comes from you for a reason, it's for the best. Yud Beis, there's a note here which says, okay, part of the vidui is about accepting upon himself the suffering righteously, justifying it. It's kind of like if a parent is punishing a child, assuming the parent is punishing the child not out of spite, not out of anger, not out of animosity, not out of frustration, not to vent their own anger, all of the things we've discussed in the past, but rather the parent is punishing the child truly for what the parent believes to be the child's good. So the child realizes what they've done wrong or the magnitude of what they've done wrong. Right? If the child is indignant, the child is brazenly denying having done anything wrong or denying the severity of what's done wrong. So in order to make the point, the parent would have to push it even further so that the child's rebellion actually brings about more punishment. Whereas if the child were to say, while the parent's arm is still stretched, you're right, I know, I did it wrong, I apologize. So that parent's hand, right, would come down, but gently, and leave the strap, right, and caress the child, rather than strap the child. So that's the point here. Right? When God brings this suffering upon us, of course, it's not out of animosity, hatred, vengeance, retribution. It's in order for us to realize that we've done something wrong or realize the magnitude of what we've done wrong. And if we rebel against that, since it's God's purpose to benefit us, that would result in the need for more suffering. But when we say, you're right, I understand, I got the message, so that's the point, was to convey the message. The message has been received, it's been transmitted. The strap is laid aside. Uperashu b'Zohar, and it was explained in the Zohar, the holy book of Jewish mysticism, but Parashas Pekudei, Shu Chelek Samael Ke'ein HaSeir, that this punishment that is brought upon a person, that's actually the portion for a destructive angel, where aside from I just having read it, we often don't even pronounce it. It's usually referred to as the Samach Mem, based on the first two letters of the word, the Samach Mem. Samael is a destructive, archetypal type of destructive angel, bring upon punishment. It's usually associated with Satan, with the Yetzer Hara, with sufferings. So he says that the Zohar compares this angel, the Samach Mem, to the Sa'ir, to this scapegoat. Umau Chelko, what is the portion that we're referring to when we say that the Samach Mem gets a portion of our suffering? Shekadosh Baruch Hu gozer alav, God decrees upon a person, Yisurim, page Chaf Dalet at the top. God decrees upon a person this type of suffering. Umiyad mizdamen sham, and immediately there, God causes the Samach Mem to appear, this destructive angel. V'hoylech v'goyve choyvoy. He goes and he collects the person's liability. V'harei noise haseir avonois. And also this scapegoat carries the transgressions. Shekadosh Baruch Hu noisen lo reshus ligvois choyvoy. God gives either the Samach Mem or this other object of the person's atonement, the scapegoat. He gives them the ability to claim a person's liabilities, his faults, his transgressions. And as a result of this, Israel mitaharin, the Jewish people become purified. What it's referring to, again, is a bit complicated, and you kind of have to be able, I think, to read a little bit into the subtleties of the notions he's raising here. But I think the idea is as follows: is that when the Malach HaMavis, the angel of death, was sent by God into Egypt in order to slay the firstborns in Egypt, we find that the Torah praises the dogs for shutting their traps, for not barking when the angel of death came through the town. And this is explained by the Gemara to mean that when the angel of death or other destructive forces are present, it's the nature of animals in general, who are, to a certain extent, have a certain extrasensory perception, and dogs in particular, to sense the spiritual presence of these forces. And dogs naturally bark and howl when these forces are present. So the dog is a watchdog, not only from physical but also from spiritual types of harmful forces. And why the dogs were praised was that they shut their traps. They didn't bark and they didn't howl when the angel of death passed through Egypt. They kept their mouths shut. And this is related to what the Gemara says, Malach HaMavis Ba'al'ir, Klavim Tzarkim. When the angel of death comes into town, the dogs, they howl. Here they kept their mouths shut. And as a result of this, they're rewarded that whenever Jews have meat that's rendered unkosher for whatever reason, it's a mitzvah to throw it to the dogs. And this way they're repaid for having kept their mouths shut when naturally they should be barking and barking and barking. So there's this idea of like throwing scraps at animals or at forces which are negative in order to keep their mouths, as it were, shut. And this can be compared to, let's say, a family who's sitting down at a meal, and they all have the plates with food on the table and everything else, and the dog come to the table, wagging the tail, bumping into people, barking, putting his paws up under the table, being a general nuisance to the family. So, what do you do in such a case? You cut out a little piece of the bone, you throw it to the dog, and the dog's nature is to take that bone and go off on its own somewhere in a corner and keep itself occupied with the bone while the family enjoys the rest of the meal. So the same thing here with the negative forces, and this has to do with this scapegoat. The scapegoat is that when the Jewish people transgress, it creates a type of negative energy which speaks evil of them, and that's personified in this angel, the Samach Mem, who's got its mouth open at every opportunity to bark and howl away at the Jewish people, making note of their negative energy that they've created, feeding upon it. And what's done is to throw this spiritual dog a bone in order to shut up its mouth. And the way this works in the two instances he's raising here is, in the case of punishment, right, if a person transgresses, God brings punishment on a person. The Samach Mem is attracted to this punishment, this suffering, which he's entitled to take his reward from, which is the kind of sensation of being satiated and satisfied by the fact that this person who's transgressed is being punished. That satisfaction it gets for the punishment is like a bone that's thrown into its mouth in order to shut its trap. Keep it quiet. Be satisfied with that little bit amount. And what results is that the person himself becomes purified as a result of that. Keeping the Samech Mem's mouth shut through the degree of suffering that the person is experiencing. And the same thing regarding this Sir Mishtalech, the Sir La'azazel, this scapegoat. Yeah? That on the one hand, there are two sacrifices, the two Seirim, and there's this Goral, this, how did you translate it yesterday? The raffle, as it were, yes, where one is raffled to be brought as a sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash in the case of holiness and purity for the purpose of atoning for the Jewish people, and the other is sent off into the wilderness, into the cliff, yes, dismembered over the bridge. That's called a Seir La'azazel. Azazel is like another type of a name referring to a negative spiritual force. So that this scapegoat is actually thrown off into the cliff, into the abyss, into the open jaws, into the maws of this negative spiritual force, which then accepts, as it were, that scapegoat and keeps its mouth shut. During the rest of Yom Kippur, when the proper formal atonement is taking place in Yerushalayim in the Beis Hamikdash, it keeps the accusing angel's mouth shut, busy with his own, as it were, with his own consumption of the sins of the Jewish people. Okay? So it's quite a complicated idea. Yeah, but the point is, it's giving a bone to chew. Keep his mouth busy, yeah, with the more inferior aspect of the Jewish people's sins, so that the proper atonement can be effected in the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim.
So it's bound by time. This angel.
It's fixed in time. I don't know if it's bound by time, but it interacts within the context of time
and location. So that's why they send it away from
something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, something like that. You know, I don't know necessarily if it's like bound to be in that place, but it interacts in time and space as a force, and it's thrown out there in the wilderness, removed far away from the Jewish habitation proper, where the proper full atonement is taking place. Like similar to, like I said, the family which gets rid of the dog by throwing it an inferior part of the meal, which is the bone. You kind of forgo the bone in order to be able to keep the family together and enjoy the meal in a proper organized fashion without the dog coming and putting its snout in everybody's plate.
So angels can't be like two places at once.
I mean, maybe they can, and I mean, this is related to, I guess, your previous point as well. I don't think that the point. Maybe not explaining it clearly, or maybe I'm reading into it something which is more clear than I'm expressing. But it's not that the angel is like there in that place, but that this kind of sacrifice, as it were, is being given to this angel in that place. But it's really everywhere. I mean, in a true sense. But the point is that this energy is being assuaded. This samach men, the accusatory qualities of this samach men, is being assuaded and mitigated because of this quote unquote sacrifice that's being offered or given to it. But that would affect it wherever it might be. The point is, it's being occupied. Its maws are being filled with a certain degree of atonement that it chews upon, as it were, and mulls over, and simultaneously keeping it out of everybody's plate, where their main meal is. Yeah. So he's still not completed with explaining why it is that the animal is dismembered, or why the adversary of the Jewish people meting out God's judgment is destroyed. He still hasn't gotten to that stage yet. He's still working through that. But that's the point which I think he'll address next. And he says that so this is what happens, and through the scapegoat going to Azazel, or through a person's suffering, then the result is that people become purified. Vine kol yisgalgel al the samach mem, everything is then rolled onto the Samech Mem. All of that punishment is then brought upon the Samech Mem. The reason for this is Shekadosh Baruch Hu gazer al olamai shekol mi sheyaseh ken yisbatel. The reason is because God decreed that anybody or anything which brings about suffering upon the Jewish people, even when it's for the purpose of purifying them, that force of negativity will itself be nullified. Yeah? And let me give an example of how this works. Think about, for example, a consuming fire. That fire consumes everything that it can get its tongue on. It'll consume it and burn it. Yeah? When it can no longer sustain itself by burning other things, basically that same power of consumption consumes itself. It's self-consuming. So that if you have a fire, logs, right? As long as you keep feeding the fire, the logs are going to stay intact. But once you stop feeding that fire with something else, the fire turns on its own source and actually destroys itself. So that ultimately, those very logs, which were the base of the flame, turn into charcoal and into ash. So that the destructive power that's implanted within these, let's say, negative forces, once they have consumed what they were supposed to consume, namely cause the suffering, but that suffering has been now atoned for, there's no other force or fuel to fuel those flames of negativity, so that they end up, the world was designed in a way that they would ultimately consume themselves and expire. And that's the crux now of his explanation. He doesn't say it conclusively, but that's his point. Before he says it conclusively, he brings another example. That's why we find in the Torah it says that a person who, for example, had some act of bestiality with an animal, the person is put to death and the animal is put to death as well. Why should the animal be put to death? Because the person committed the transgression with it. The answer is because that this animal became an agent through which the person transgressed, and therefore, once this person is, or not say once, but even, I don't know whether I should say once or even, let's try both, right? Once or even when this person is punished, the object of the punishment is also removed. Why? That's part of its ultimate atonement. Once that fire consumes the transgression, then it's turned against itself and consumes itself. So once the person who has transgressed, in this case committed bestiality and therefore receives the death penalty, the animal that was the part of this transgression is also consumed. Why? Because once the atonement takes place, the object of the need for that atonement has to be nullified. Okay? What's that?
It's not needed anymore. It did its job.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's like, that's why I don't know if it's even or it's once, but it's really both. And therefore, the same thing would apply. He's going to give another example. V'cheno even shel mitzvahs in the skolim, and the same thing we find regarding the stone that was used to stone a person, where the capital punishment was stoning. V'asayif shel mitzvah, or a sword, where the capital punishment was decapitation. Whether it's the case of the stone that was used or the sword to mete out the deserving capital punishment for this very heinous crime that the person committed, once that atonement takes place, tu'unin kavura, the objects of the atonement have to be buried, nullified, disintegrated. Why? Because the capital punishment has undone the transgression. The person has become atoned for. Therefore, the instrument through which the atonement takes place must by necessity be neutralized, because the atonement has already taken place. Levatel mitziusam v'koicham achar shigmor dinam, in order to nullify them once their judgment has been executed, or once they have been used to execute that judgment. The implication, I think, is quite clear. Maybe he'll spell it out more explicitly later, but at this point I think it's certainly fair to extrapolate, and what he means to say is the same thing regarding, for example, those people who are used as agents to exact punishment / atonement from the Jewish people. Once they've done so, and the Jewish people's transgression has been atoned for, then the object used to effect that atonement must be nullified, because the atonement has been achieved. So that Pharaoh, for example, or Haman, or any of the others who were used as the stone, or were used as the sword, or were used as the scapegoat, or any of the other manifestations of the examples that he's brought, they are nullified by virtue of the fact that the atonement has been effected. That's the point. So in this way, he's explaining the initial question. Why is it that Haman or the others were destroyed? Or why is it that the scapegoat is destroyed? The answer is that this scapegoat is used to shut the traps of the Samech Mem in order for the proper atonement of the Jewish people to take place. And once it does, once the atonement is effected, then the object which is used to catalyze that atonement must be turned on itself. The destructive quality of that instrument is turned on itself, no longer being able to be fueled by the transgression of the Jewish people, and therefore it devours itself, it consumes itself, or it's put into a position where it will be consumed for that reason. And remember, all of this is connected to the idea of God's throwing our transgressions into the depths of the sea. We'll have to see how he ties it into the Midah towards the end of this chapter, but I think we'll have to stop here because the next section is also quite involved and requires a lot of elaboration, so we don't have the time to do it. It's better not to start.